and I joined in that. And in that capacity, I was a poll watcher. We weren't really allowed to say we were from the Obama campaign, although we were. But that was, that was sort of a very satisfying thing for me to do, because again, like Laverne did, I was helping people in a very concrete way to vote. It's fine to, I think, call people and do phone banking, but this was a lot more concrete, a lot more immediate, and I just found that very rewarding. So in 2012 and in 2016, I was able to go to Ohio again. This time it wasn't with the Obama campaign, it was actually under the auspices of the Secretary of State in Ohio. It was never entirely clear to us why they wanted to hire out-of-state lawyers, but they did. What we did then was we were actually working at the Board of Elections, and that was in a nonpartisan capacity. So, and again, it was very, very rewarding work. We were not working for one side or the other. We were helping everybody vote, and that's why I got involved in it, just because it was, as a lawyer, New York Board of Elections law is extremely complicated. So this was sort of a way for me to do something without having to get into, sort of the real Byzantine, statutory scheme. So that's why I did that.
Thank you. So what I love is how different all of our stories are, because I think I am the poster child for community volunteer who the local Democratic Committee got word of, because in a place like Croton it's hard to hide. And so because of the other volunteer work I had done, I somehow got drawn into the local Democratic Committee, and just did things that sound so much less glamorous than what you did, but getting people to put their names on the ad in the local paper saying, we support these candidates, or putting out posters, or just things that seem very, very minor until I look at them in the scope of everything that's going on. This whole every election is a local election and how important they are. So I really just got into it because it seemed like the next step in community service, and all these little things are really big things when you're living in a small community. And so I really saw it as my way of giving back to my community, and then being able to be connected to this greater thing. I do just have to say that watching the scenes from election night brought back memories that I really thought I'd like to bury forever, but on that note.
I guess, since you've had to live with me for over an hour, I don't have to say really a lot more about it, but it was just, I started driving people to the polls because there were people that didn't have a way to get there. And I think it was just a sense of what Claire says in the movie, if I can help one person, just one person, that's enough. So with that, it means that you can do anything, because it has the ability to help that one person.
Questions? Everyone wants to be the last question. No one wants to be the first question. So.
Do you have to be a lawyer?
No, please don't call that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait, there you go.
Thank you. For Laverne, are you going to be back in North Carolina for the next election? And are you coordinating volunteers?
Well, we've never done a midterm before, but we're going to do a midterm this year because sort of three things are happening. I mean, there's been a lot of pushback in North Carolina on a lot of different levels, so we think that we need to be there for that. We now know people there, so it's easier than it's been before. And although there's lots of stuff to do in New York, so you don't have to travel, but it's easier for us because we know people. And just yesterday, I was talking to some folks down there, and there's going to be a huge mess because of the flooding. And even in 2016, when we ended up in Fayetteville, part of the reason why there was confusion about where people needed to go was because polling places were closed and people were being sent to places that in the end they really couldn't vote. So that's not going to be any better this time around. So we'll be going back up for the week before Election Day and Election Day with a group. So if you want to come, we'll have space.
Do you have to be a lawyer?
No.
To do what?
Well,
To do that work.
Practice law.
No,
To do the work.
certainly. I mean,
Because most of the people were lawyers, I think one of them specifically said they weren't. So I was just curious, like, is there training, is there documentation, how do you?
There is. There's fairly extensive documentation. What we did in Ohio in 2012 and 2016 was we went, I think a couple of days before, I think we got there on Saturday or Sunday, and there was day-long training for the elections board and how to use the computers and how to tell people where to go to vote and so on. You don't really have to be a lawyer. I mean, I think this was, I don't really, again, I'm not really certain why they wanted to hire lawyers, but there was nothing actually legal about the work itself. It was just sort of, nitty-gritty, learning to use databases and so on. So you don't have to be a lawyer. This was organized by a lawyer who had his own firm in New York. But no, there's nothing especially legal about the work.
you don't have to be a lawyer, but there are some things that help if you have the swagger of a lawyer. I mean, there's some things that help if you can say, no, that's not the way it works, and talk. Well, in the case of North Carolina, there are poll judges inside, and so sometimes you say, no, that I've read the 66 pages of law. That's not the way this works. So, but you don't have to be a lawyer to do that.
While I was watching it, and I don't recall that they clarified it, but that's not a judge in the way that we think of a judge.
No.
No, it's an election. The actual term is.
We don't have that term in New York.
No.
Yes. Since I don't see anybody's hand up right now, I'll just say it was oh, okay, you're next. You mentioned South Carolina and how they're, even we're talking, it's still 6 weeks away, right? How many weeks until the election? But that they're going to have, their polling places are going to be impacted by the aftermath of the storm. Does anybody remember when we had Superstorm Sandy? It was late October. I wasn't quite in office yet, but I was trustee-elect, so I was privy to some of the meetings with Con Edison, and we had a number of polling places that had no power just a week before the election, and that became a top priority for restoring power in all of the polling locations. It's just interesting. It was a much more manageable challenge, and we had time, but the fact that South Carolina is already concerned about what the the conditions are going to be in November 6th, based on the storm that happened last week. It's a real life, tangible concern. I think figure out.
I have a question about purges. I was canvassing up in the New York 19th Congressional District, which is going to be a very heavily contested election. Antonio Delgado is running against Paso, and I was up there on Sunday canvassing in a very suburban neighborhood, big houses, and everybody's lawn was perfect, and it turned out to be a very diverse, somewhat diverse population. And people were very friendly. Knocked on one door, and the man who was on my list was the only African, well, he was Jamaican, person of color. The only person I canvassed, one of the only ones who was a person of color, and he was very supportive of the candidate I was working for. And then he said, "But I've got a problem. I went to vote in the primary last week, and I've been voting here for 29 years, and my name wasn't on the registration list." So what do we do about that? He knew that he had to go register again, but he couldn't vote in the primary, and he will be able to vote in the general election. And I'm just really wondering what other kinds of dirty tricks are being played here in New York.
As are we all.
Does anybody have any suggestion about, this was kind of a upstate.
Yeah. And he's voted in primaries before. It's not just that he's registered and he's been voting for 20 years. He's been
29 years he lives in that.
Yeah. I just want to make sure because we had people who, it was a Democratic primary, obviously everybody knows that, who showed up at the polls in Ossining, and either they didn't know that they didn't live in the village, and they were mad that they couldn't vote in the village primary, and some of them just walked out and said, wait, but there's a gubernatorial race and all these other state races you should pay attention to. Or other people who didn't realize that they weren't registered Democrats. It was the first time they bothered to show up to try and vote in a primary. So I was just wondering if that could be the situation. But
He was a
you're saying,
regular voter, and he said his wife's name was on the list, but his name was not.
interesting.
Yeah, we were hearing a fair amount of that, actually, of people getting to polling places and not being able to vote and not being sure why. I know one lady who had lived in Harlem and moved to Brooklyn, and she went to vote in Brooklyn, and they said, well, no, we don't have you registered here, and they said something like, well, the voter registration can take a while to get from Harlem to Brooklyn, which makes no sense. And it's just ridiculous. So I don't know why that happened. The only thing I can suggest to do about it, I guess, is vote locally. I think, all politics is local, and that's about it.
I didn't ask him if he was told that he could cast a provisional ballot.
I didn't ask him if he was told that he could cast a provisional ballot, but,
I'll just say, I don't know if every county is different, but in Westchester County, remember earlier in the meeting I was saying if you, this evening, if you wanted to update your party registration so that it could take effect next year, it's only after the general election that all of the voter rolls are updated. So in the case of somebody who moved boroughs, if it's the same in New York City as it is here, they do, I think, I actually had cause to find out that not only did they not do it until after the November election, but they actually didn't do it 2 years ago until the following February when they got around to updating their paperwork, because there weren't any elections happening between November and February, but there would be in March in some of the local races in some of the local villages, so I guess that's when they decided to catch up with their paperwork. So somebody moving boroughs, if it's that same standard in New York City, she probably could have cast a provisional ballot and it probably would have still counted. I would like you to, I'm glad there was some explanation of provisional ballots here, but those were some really disturbing numbers, like only 1/3 of provisional ballots that were cast actually counted. I'll just tell you, tomorrow happens to be the day when Westchester County will be opening up all of the absentee and provisional ballots, and you can go to the Board of Elections and watch them get opened. In our case, there were 80 absentee ballot applications submitted. They may or may not have actually been mailed in, but they would have been received by now. And we didn't thankfully have in our community, which is the one that I've been watching closely, any major failures of machines. So we don't expect there were too many provisional ballots. And there was no vote, at least not locally, that was within that margin. So it's not terribly relevant, but it might have been very different in North Carolina in 2016. And can you explain why would 2/3 of them have been tossed out?
Well, it was because a lot of things were going on then. I mean, when you see the number of more than 1,200 people coming to vote and only 598 being able to vote, it's a really depressing number. But it doesn't take into consideration all of the things that made that happen. At the end of the night, I was at Cliffdale Center, and it's right near a big Air Force base. So a number of provisional ballots had to do with military, and that didn't work out well. Some of the provisional ballots were because of the flooding. Some of it was the DMV, which was a total screw up in so many ways. People registered and either by design or just by kind of failure. They didn't show up on the rolls, and so then they had a vote by a provisional ballot. And so a lot of times when people think of voter suppression, they think of it being one thing. It's not one thing. It's layers and layers and layers of a lot of different things. And so you have to try to address those different layers and to make the system work better. And because we've been doing this work in North Carolina, we're working with some of the groups that are trying to deal with each one of these individual things.
Thank you. To follow up actually on what you were just saying about how there are so many different failures in our voting system, I'd like to ask each one of you, what reform, like if you could make one reform or one or two reforms, what would that be to make our voting system better and more democratic?
I would actually,
Each one.
yeah, no, I got it. I would actually institute same-day registration. I would also institute, and this has happened to me a couple of times, I won't get into it, but I think it would be very useful to have an option to vote near where you work rather than where you live. And I think that would really increase the turnout because, it can, I'm very motivated to vote. I'm an upper middle class, professional. And, I came about this close to not voting in my primary because I was just saying, oh God, I have to walk a half a mile to vote. And then I said, what am I talking about? What kind of an example is that setting? But it would have been very easy, much easier for me if I could vote in the Flatiron district instead of Jackson Heights where I live. So that's probably the one I would implement.
I'll have to agree with you. I think that same-day registration could make a huge difference, especially living in a community like Croton where there is a large influx of people who, say, have moved up from the city who maybe one person is still commuting to the city, but one person is not. So it's easy for somebody to go to their old polling place, but certainly not for a mom who's home with a young child now and isn't able to do that. The other thing I think would be the redrawing of the districts. And we can see that a lot here just with some of the senatorial districts around here. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, the Hudson River is very important to all of us because it is right here. But being able to group that, on each side, or just in ways that make more sense. So I would be all for redrawing the districts in a way that makes more sense, largely, and even within, a small village like Croton, does it make sense where you're voting? So that would be mine.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in a half hour. Please note that the computers will be shutting down in about 15 minutes. Please save all your work.
I would say the same thing, and if I had to come up with the third, I would probably go for a voting day that was on the weekend.
Yeah.
I'm surprised nobody said early voting.
Early voting also, but I sort of think of that when I think of on the weekend, yes.
So, the question was about making the system better, but it seemed, when you talk about the layers and layers, it doesn't feel like it's so much the system as it is the forces that are conspiring, if you will, to suppress the vote and what feels like a large organized, semi-organized effort across the country. Toward the end, there was a person who said, both sides do it when they're in power. Do we think that's true? Am I naive to think that both sides don't do it equally when they're in power? Gerrymandering to some degree, sure, but voter roll?
Well, I think Steve was talking at that moment mostly about gerrymandering, but I don't think that it's equal between both sides, but I think that part of the assumption that political gerrymandering is okay, as kind of a basic underlying principle, it's not okay. And that is kind of a both side thing. There are lots of other things that are not equal. I agree with you there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's a really systemic problem. Now, to be honest, was a little startled when I heard him say it was both sides, because my first instinct is to say, well, no, it's not. So I agree that, gerrymandering, yes, but the sort of systemic problems, I won't say anything other than I don't think it's only one side. I don't think it's both sides.
Sure, and I'll just add to that, of course, I'm looking at this from a much more local level, and I do think that at a local level, there is, what you guys are doing seems insurmountable to me, but I think that at the village level, I feel like we can make a difference, we are making a difference, we know who the voters are, we know who needs a ride to the polls, and especially with, the local Democratic Committee does a lot, but also with other groups like Indivisible getting involved where they're less, I'm working with a woman who's very interested in driving people who can't get to the polls, and it's completely nonpartisan, which I guess is okay. I sort of joked with her when I met with her, but I said, I don't know, do I want to drive Republicans to the polls? Of course, I'm just kidding. But, I think locally we do have a lot of control over this, and we can do a lot of good. We know our neighbor next door, they can't get there. So I think that, it's a much smaller impact in some ways, but in some ways it's a great impact still.
It's not smaller.
Different.
Yeah, different, but it's not smaller at all.
I was about to leave, but since the subject came up, I wanted to tell a quick story. I was volunteering for the presidential election when it was Clinton-Bush. Yeah, I think it was Clinton-Bush. And a group of friends and I went out to Bayonne, New Jersey, because it was a lock in New York State, but New Jersey was iffy. So we said, let's go to Bayonne. We went to the Democratic headquarters there and said, how can we help? They said, we need people to go to the hospital and let the patients in the hospital fill out paper ballots. So we did that, and I thought, well, we don't know if they're voting Democrat or Republican, but at least we're letting them vote. We got back to the headquarters afterwards, and the woman who was running the show there said, give me the Bush ballots. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I'm collecting all the Bush ballots. And I said, well, I don't know which are which. I said, here's the ballots, I don't know whose are whose. But the other people that were volunteering had sorted them out, and she took them. And I assume she got rid of them somehow. So even though I agree it's a pretty lopsided thing, it still happens. And it was funny, because some of my friends said, the ends justify the means. They were fine with it. I wasn't, and I called the national headquarters and told them the story. And they said, that's Bayonne. So that was pretty disconcerting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just one quick comment. In Ohio, I know they have pretty strict protocols for what happens to the ballot. They have to have one Democrat and one Republican, and they take them. So I can't speak about New Jersey, sadly, but in Ohio, that I don't think would happen.
That's Bayonne.
Hi, one of you mentioned that all politics is local. I love that line. And I was just wondering, are there election day rules that are different for local elections versus federal elections? Like, are there issues we should be aware of that will be different? Or are there rules looking like provisional ballots? Are there provisional ballots for local elections as well as federal elections?
I was the one who said that, so I guess I'll answer that. That's actually a very good question, and I'm not actually sure of the answer. I don't know if we have provisional ballots in New York. Do you know?
Yes, we do.
We do. Okay. So I don't actually know of any real differences in the voting. I mean, I've never encountered. I mean, when I deal with election laws, strictly state. So I don't know much about federal voting procedures, except maybe in Ohio, which doesn't help you. But again, I think I think people need to get more involved in local voting. People are very focused on national voting, which is fine, but I think people need to get more interested in the local city council, et cetera, et cetera.
Zach, you live in City Hall or Tarrytown,
Yep,
right?
Hall, yep.
And you guys vote for your local elections in like March, right?
Yep.
So that is handled differently. Croton moved to Westchester Board of Elections a few years back. Ossining does Westchester Board of Elections, and so it's the same people, the same organization that does all the state and federal. There are some villages like yours that have that do it locally, and so it would be handled slightly differently, but it's all New York State election law, so it should still be consistent with how the ballots are handled, and if there's provisional ballots, it should be consistent. It's just that the local village clerk will be managing it.
In North Carolina, the areas that were flooded out, I don't know, do they use, it's all paper ballots there?
It's not all paper ballots, but there are there's both. Sorry, there's both paper ballots and electronic voting.
So if machines break down because of flooding or a disaster, can a state board of election order paper ballots if officially voting is electronic?
They can.
So, with the upcoming elections, you had a bag of tricks, I guess, to expect, based on everything we saw in the film. Voter suppression going forward, are there new ideas that you hear about, that you're concerned about in terms of trending for voter suppression?
I mean, I don't know. Every election is different, and you have to look at the time. In 2008, the most canny version of it, to me, was that
Can you hold it a little closer? I was trying to see.
the North Carolina. Thanks. the North Carolina election that year had set up the ballot where you could vote a straight ticket, so you could vote either straight Republican or straight Democrat, but you would not have voted for the president. You would have to flip over the ballot and turn it around to actually vote for the president. That wasn't just a mistake. So, I mean, for example, a lot of the work that was done outside the poll just that day was just explaining that to voters.
Very good.
No, it wasn't you.
Okay.
That was my fault. Okay. Susan, you have the microphone.
I have a question that kind of looks at it from the other end of the process. I don't see a lot of political point being made about the rules that are being changed. I don't see people campaigning against those that voted for voter ID law, or 200,000 people were purged from the New York City rolls for the 2006 primary. They admitted in a court of law. Seems like somebody did that on purpose. Somebody told them to do that. And yet, the story itself isn't very interesting, and there doesn't seem to be any political consequence. What's up with that?
I can venture a guess. I mean, the status quo, those, but I mean, maybe everybody else has a different idea, but that's mine. I mean, I think that's why the things don't change. I think that's why voting is so difficult, because those in power have a vested interest in making it difficult to vote. So I think that's probably the answer.
I just want to say I'm very inspired tonight, and I really appreciate you all being here and seeing this one. I'm an election poll worker, and I have been for a number of years now. And so on the other side, it's so wonderful to see everybody trying to vote, and they've been encouraged, but we count the people who come, especially for the primary. Last year in September, I'm in a district where the whole day 40 people came to vote, and it's just very, very sad when you see this other side. This year we had 102 people, and that doesn't include absentee ballots that get counted. You know, my daughter is away at college, she was in the roster, but that's another side of voting that needs to be addressed in some form or another. I just want to say that to you tonight.
I will say, in the village of Ossining, there are 6,466 registered Democrats, and almost 40% of them came out in the primary, which is pretty good for an off-year Thursday primary.
What is the percentage in general election?
I'm not sure, actually. We only did the analysis last week because people had really skewed numbers, and they thought it was a low turnout, which just didn't seem right, because we knew that there was a higher turnout because we had a highly contested mayoral race and a very engaged Senate race in Ossining. So it didn't make sense that we were going to have 20% turnout, and we didn't. We had nearly 40% turnout, which is really quite good.
Well, in Brooklyn, supposedly, the number of Democrats voting in the primary doubled. So, you know, like literally doubled. So, and I think that's because people are getting angry, which I think is good.
Yeah.
I know I am.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and I'll give you all just a last statement. If there's something that you didn't get a chance to express, or that you think that we should take with us when we leave the room. And thank everyone for joining us tonight. Please come back October 18th for Resilience, which is a very different film about early childhood trauma and how that can impact your health.
Just do something. Vote. Make sure your friends vote, and make sure that you're available to help others to be able to vote.
I agree with that. And
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 10 minutes. If you have any items you wish to check out, please bring them to the circulation desk now. The library will be open tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Thank you, and have a good evening.
So I agree with that. But I also think that we all have to get a lot less reticent about talking about politics. I think a lot of us don't want to talk about it because you get in fights with people and it can be uncomfortable, and I think we have to not do that anymore. I think we have to make people uncomfortable, and I think that's the only way anything will change.
Thank you. When Victoria mentioned what she did about the turnout for the primary, I was thinking about the feedback that I was getting from people at the polls, and people who I didn't think were noticing anything, you know, who didn't really pay attention, were coming out and going on social media and posting what time they voted and what number they were. And I thought that this was really, people are plugged into, now of course they were thinking that the numbers looked low because they would look low, but it didn't, the reality of what they were posting didn't matter. People are paying attention now, and I think that is really where the opportunity, especially locally, is, because there are so many ways to be involved locally, whether it's just voting or making sure your neighbor votes or putting out a lawn sign, whatever it is. The possibilities are really endless, and I think that we are on the cusp of a huge opportunity here to make some great things happen. So, thank you.
Thank you all very much for joining us. And I'll just say, if you are interested in getting involved in politics, if you live in Cortland, you should talk to Maria if you're a registered Democrat. If you live in Ossining and you're a registered Democrat, please, you can tag me on the way out and ask me how you can get to a meeting, how you can become more involved and find out how to get in on the ground floor. Did you have a question, sir?
I do have a question. I know that when people came in, they could become a friend of the series. Is it permissible to do so on the way out?
Yes. There's a beautifully decorated box out in the hallway with butterflies on it, and tiny little handcrafted envelopes where you can put a donation, tell us your name and your email address, and then you will see your name up in lights in a future screening. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And also, if you need a voter registration update or an absentee ballot application, those are still out there too. Thank you very much.